After some time, I wrote a sequel to The Lonely Little Flower, and it was called The Garden. Imagine, if you will, a beautiful garden with flowers of every color, shape, and size. A garden so full of lovely fragrances that the aromas seem to lift one right off the ground, to dance among the breathtaking melodies that float along on the breeze. To find oneself lost in the tranquility of the sound, the music, the singing, the joy that seems to come from nowhere, yet from all around. A place so beautiful words cannot describe even a tenth of its wonder, its majesty. But it is in the midst of such a place, a garden so to speak, that we see the flower, a lovely, peaceful, yet simple flower. This flower, once known as the Lonely Little Flower, is almost unrecognizable to anyone but the gardener and his servant. She has taken on a transformation so remarkable that it would seem there was nothing left of the flower that she had once been. However, upon close inspection, one can see the trace of tiny scars that still remain. These don't bother the lonely little flower any longer, for she treasures them because they are a reminder of the remarkable journey she has traveled. To find out how this once lonely little flower came to belong in this beautiful place, we must go back to where we last saw her. There she was, abandoned in the middle of a dry, hot, desolate place. She had lost all hope of ever finding a place she belonged, a place she could, or would want, to call home. Each day she withered a little more, as the sun relentlessly beat down upon her already frail frame. Her leaves were lying limp at her sides, and she no longer could lift her head to look upon the sky. It was a day like every other, at a time when the scorching sun was at its highest point, that the miracle began. Just as the lonely little flower was about to give up and collapse on the ground, she felt a slight temperature drop, and a shadow appeared on the ground around her. She could no longer feel the intensity of the afternoon heat. Did she dare to look around to see what was causing this change? What if it was some large creature about to completely snuff the life from her? Taking the last ounce of courage she possessed, she opened her eyes just the slightest bit. And what she saw confused and intrigued her. Standing over the lonely little flower was the servant. The servant looked like all the others who'd been transplanted her in the past from one home to the next. But there was something different about this one. There seemed to be a kindness in this one's eyes, a look of such love and compassion the lonely little flower had never seen before. For whatever reason, the lonely little flower was not afraid. She just waited. But the servant made no effort to dig her out of the ground or even to come closer. This puzzled the lonely little flower, for she did not understand why the servant would be there if not to take her away like all the rest had done. She had no knowledge that the servant had been watching her and had already spoken to the gardener on her behalf. The gardener had given his servant wisdom to know that the lonely little flower was much too fragile, and that moving her would put her at even greater risk. So the servant just stood next to her and continued to block the rays of the sun. The lonely little flower was so thankful for the shade she almost thought it wasn't real, and before she knew it, and much too soon to her liking, the servant had left for the night, and once again she was alone. The lonely little flower wondered to herself if it would have been better if the servant had never come, for she found the loneliness almost worse, and the hope that had begun to spark in her heart that day was quickly dying down. Why did the servant leave and not take her with? Was she that horrid, that unlovable, that hopeless? She wondered these things late into the night until she had convinced herself that it had all been a dream. Imagine her surprise when the following day the servant once again stood and blocked the sun from burning down upon her. Could this be true? Why did the servant come back? Is today the last time for a visit? Why didn't the servant just take her away? Why must she stay here alone in this desert? All of these thoughts tumbled around in the head of the lonely little flower. She had no idea why the servant would come back and spend time with her. She felt she was hopeless, lost, and although she secretly dared to hope otherwise, she knew there was nothing anyone could do for her. But this lonely little flower was not really hopelessly lost. You see, the servant knew the gardener and knew that he was capable of restoring any and all damage that had been done to one of his little ones. It would take time, though, before the lonely little flower was ready to travel the distance to the garden. The servant, knowing this, did the only thing that could be done to help bring comfort to the lonely little flower where she was. Until she was ready, the servant, along with blocking the extreme heat from the sun, would bring drops of cool, fresh water to gently dab on the lonely little flower's thirsty leaves and stem. This continued for days and on into weeks. Each morning, the lonely little flower would awake, finding herself doubting the reality of the servant and wondering if it had all been a dream. However, each afternoon, when the servant would come again, the lonely little flower's heart would beat faster, and slowly she began to trust that this stranger would continue to come. She began to look forward to the visits more and more, for not only did the servant bring shade and comfort to the lonely little flower, but also wonderful stories. The lonely little flower loved to listen to all the interesting tales the servant spoke of, her favorite being stories of the gardener. He fascinated her, and she wondered if she would ever meet the gardener. Well, of course, the thought of meeting him face to face scared her. She had lots of people in her past who had the job of a gardener, taking her from place to place and caring for her to the best of their ability. And look where she was. Each time she only ended up in more pain. Could she trust that this gardener would be different? She wasn't sure. But somehow, his servant made her long for the day when she can go and be with him in his garden. That, of course, being dependent on him even wanting one, such as her. After many months, the servant felt the lonely little flower had grown strong enough to travel to the garden. The lonely little flower had come to trust the servant, and the day arrived for the big event. The servant was ever so gentle when digging the sand away from the little fragile roots of the lonely little flower, and placing the little flower into a tiny pot that was filled with soil full of nutrients and so moist it felt calming to the little flower's roots. Then the servant ever so carefully carried the little flower all the way from the dry, desolate place and brought her to the large, open space known as the garden. The lonely little flower looked around and began to shake. There were too many other flowers around, and the little flower was scared that they would be like the others in her life. Well, she was also afraid of losing her new friend, the servant, and she wondered if the servant would ever come to see her again in this new place. But the servant was very wise, and after consulting with the gardener, placed the lonely little flower way back near the gardener's home, away from the other flowers. There, the lonely little flower stayed for many weeks. Each day the servant would come visit her just as before, and this made the lonely little flower happy. Her roots began to grow down into the rich, moist soil. Her leaves began to change into a brilliant green, and her petals no longer drooped. Sometimes the lonely little flower would hear the gardener walking in the garden, and she would hide her face, too ashamed to let him see her. She was afraid that he would have her removed from his beautiful garden if he ever truly looked at her hideousness, because she felt she didn't belong, even though she longed to. What the lonely little flower did not know was that each day when the servant would visit with the lonely little flower, the gardener would stand at his window and gaze down lovingly at the progress she was making. One day, The lonely little flower realized that the wounds in her stem had closed and no longer brought her pain when the winds blew against them. She began to look out past her little corner and she saw other flowers. She longed to get to know them, and soon afterwards, the servant once again came to transplant the lonely little flower deeper into the garden. This time, it wasn't as scary for her. By then, the lonely little flower knew the servant would continue to visit her no matter where she was moved. The lonely little flower found herself being planted into the ground. No longer would she be separated from the others in her own special pot. Now, she would be grafted right into the actual garden. Yikes! For the first few days, the lonely little flower worried that the gardener would see her and pull her up and toss her outside his garden. But after a week or so, and as she began to know the others around her, she realized that this gardener was indeed different than any she had ever known. It wasn't long before the little flower no longer felt lonely. She was surrounded by others, some like her who were still mending and getting used to this new place, and others who'd been in the garden for years and years and had many wonderful stories to share. The stories were usually about the gardener, and the little flower just loved to hear about how kind and good he was. She even began to notice that she didn't drop her head and hide when she would hear the gardener on his daily walks through the garden. He still kept his distance from her. She was sure he kept up to date on her progress, but she knew he was aware that she would still cower in fear if she met him in person. So he was content, for the moment, to just make his presence known without scaring the little flower by coming too close. With each day that went by, the little flower became stronger, and the images and remembrances of her past grew ever dimmer and faded into the background, until they no longer seemed to affect her at all. She had made wonderful friends with the lovely flowers around her, and she even joined with them as their voices floated on the breeze in praise to the gardener. She was so grateful to the gardener for bringing her to this wonderful place, and so thankful to the gardener for creating such a safe place and for allowing her to stay there. Her heart was so full of joy that she couldn't help but notice the new little flowers that arrived in the garden from time to time, and long for them to know the goodness that she had tasted in this place. She would then remember where she had once come from, and it filled her heart with such love for the gardener that she finally had found a place where she belonged, where she was wanted, where she could grow and become the flower that the gardener had always intended her to be, and where her voice could sing out and join with the melody that can be heard whistling through the leaves in this wonderful place, the garden. Thanks for listening.